Hi everyone, I'm Ross FAIRGRIEVE from the Walker Institute at the University of Reading, and welcome to this discussion on net zero targets and their place in mitigating global climate change. To discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by three expert panellists. First, we have ROCHA, who's a policy analyst and scientist at the OECD, currently working on a project on losses and damages from climate change. MARCIA has worked for the past decade on the interface between policy and climate science. Next we have Simon Evans, who's Deputy Editor and Policy Editor at Carbon Brief, covering climate policy and related energy developments. Finally, we have STEFÁN Smith, who's Associate Professor in Energy Systems and the Built Environment at the University of Reading, and co-investigator at the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. His research is focused around physical, social, technical interactions in relation to energy demand. Welcome guys, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So first of all, net zero targets. I suppose we better discuss kind of what they are loosely. So Simon, could you just give us a bit of an explanation of what we mean by net zero?
Yeah, so net zero targets really derive from the kind of linear relationship between the amount of CO2 that has been emitted by humanity over all time, because it stays in the atmosphere for a very long time, and the amount of warming that we will ultimately see for the planet. So that effectively creates a carbon budget, which means for any given temperature limit, if we want a 1.5 limit or a 2 degrees limit or even a 3 degrees limit, there's an associated carbon budget, and that's the amount of carbon that we can emit while still staying within that temperature. And the kind of consequence of that is that if we want to stabilize temperatures, whether it's at 1.5 or another level, we have to stop emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, because we can't necessarily stop literally all sources of CO2 emissions, we may have to effectively have a net zero target where some emissions continue. That might be from agriculture, for example, but those continued residual emissions are offset by removals elsewhere.
And a lot of people watching this will be familiar with the Paris Agreement and the kind of 1.5 to 2 degree C targets. STEFÁN, can I ask you, in terms of commitments that have been made, do these kind of line up with the Paris Agreement? And how are these looking in terms of the commitments that have been made versus the commitments that I suppose need to be made if we're going to stay below the kind of temperatures that we're hoping to stay below?
Well, I think I would see it that the agreements made with the Paris agreements are actually driving what we're doing at the moment to try and understand how we stay within target of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And I think we are setting reasonable targets to achieve that. There's questions and debate around whether we're doing that quickly enough and what the consequences of what we're doing now have for future generations and sort of longevity of the sorts of transitions that we're seeing towards a low carbon or zero carbon, or rather net zero carbon economy. I think the other important thing is the 2050 target, and actually in some cases the sort of more ambitious 2030 targets, because the idea of tipping points in terms of the climate science are important as well to understand. The levels of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere may be able to exceed a certain point in terms of parts per million, but we want to see them coming down over time, and it's the sort of time trajectory that has as well, which matters to hitting the 1.5 or 2 degree target. There's growing realization that things have to happen more quickly, at least sort of like an initial momentum towards sort of driving towards net zero.
And we'll definitely come back to some of the specifics around kind of the things that might be required in order to reach these targets shortly. But if I can just think about the net zero targets themselves as well. They're also differently understood, shall we say, or differently implemented by different countries. Sometimes they include certain sectors, sometimes they don't. Marcia, would you be able to just talk us through some of those kind of, if you like, fine print issues that kind of differentiate net zero targets from others?
I think there's still a bit of unclarity. I don't think all countries have formulated their targets in a clear manner yet, but this doesn't mean they won't. But some of those aspects on which those different targets vary, they do have implications, and important implications for the strength of the targets, actually. The first issue is very important, is emissions coverage. So when we are talking about net zero in line with 1.5, we are talking about net zero of all greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century, with the very hard to abate non-CO2 sources of emissions being then compensated by negative CO2 emissions. So this is what best science is telling us is in line with 1.5. So in the way that countries are formulating that targets, it is important that all emissions are targeted, that if it's only CO2, what is it that they're planning to do with the remainder of emissions? So we've seen targets where one gas, for example, was left out. Then there's the issue of coverage of sectors, for example. So there are some sectors that are harder to abate. So how can are these included? Are these not included? Then there's the issue whether emissions reductions will happen within the country, within its borders, or whether emissions are whether countries are planning to reduce those emissions and purchase, for example, emissions reductions from elsewhere, and how. There are the important issues of, for example, international aviation and shipping emissions, which are sectors that are very hard to abate, to attribute emissions also to start with. So how do these net zero targets actually contemplate those emissions? These are some of the architecture issues that I would say are really important for what the atmosphere really sees, and what is it that these targets, if we sum them up, whether they will lead or not to actually net zero. And then in terms more from a policy or politics of the target, they still vary a lot in terms of whether they are legally binding, they are enshrined in law, in national law. And then we have targets that are just in, for example, policy documents, such as the long-term strategies that countries submit to the UNFCCC. So they're like many formats of the targets, and definitely some are more stringent and have more credibility than others. So this also adds to the strength of the target. This is I would say, the start of this road. The momentum of countries putting forward these targets is a very encouraging one, a very welcoming one, but it's really just the start of what they're going to do. And in going forward, I think these issues need to be clarified.
You know, the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees set out a range of ways of keeping warming below that level, and they found the median pathway involved cutting emissions by 2030 by 45% compared to 2010 levels, and reaching net zero emissions in CO2 by 2050, followed by net zero in terms of all greenhouse gas emissions by 2070. That's really the context. That's where the 2050 net zero has come from. And then in terms of what has actually been announced by countries, we've got net zero targets, predominantly 2050, and a lot of those are for all greenhouse gases. The UK's, for example, same with the EU. Others are CO2 only. But collectively, there are now, I think, about 3/4 of global emissions covered by a net zero target of some sort or other. And then, as Marcia already mentioned, the question becomes, what's the coverage of the target? Is it CO2? Is it GHG? What's the policy context? Is there backing to actually reach the goal, or is it just a kind of a lofty ambition that will never be fulfilled? And crucially, is there some sort of intermediate target or some kind of stepping stone on the way to 2050? Because after all, that's 30 years away. And if we don't do stuff in the next decade, this decade is really crucial. And if we don't make progress by 2030, along the lines of cutting emissions by 45%, then there's no way that we would subsequently be able to get to net zero by 2050. And more importantly, the carbon budget is finite. So if we emit more in the 2020s, we would have to cut emissions by impossible amounts in the 2040s and beyond.
And Stefan, Simon raised the point there that potentially without a strategy, these are just kind of lofty ambitions. What are the things that need to be implemented soon if governments are going to start actually meeting some of these kind of ambitions that they've made?
A lot of this boils down to energy, right? And our use of energy, not in total, but a big chunk. And so some of it is about understanding how we can change the fuel sources that we have for reducing, our dependence on fossil fuels. And so we're all perhaps familiar with, ideas of solar voltaics, solar thermal, wind turbines, etc. We're addicted to energy, and we're addicted to it in lots of different ways, in terms of the way it sort of conveniences life, the way it enables us to do, sort of wonderful things within our life. So there's questions around how we maybe think about the expectations we have in terms of what we do and how we do it. We're, I think, globally quite good in terms of thinking about transitions of energy systems and transitions towards renewables as our generation source. We're beginning to more and more think about the consequences of that transition in relation to the infrastructures which support those sorts of generation types, and how that matches or doesn't match with the way we demand energy. A lot of it is technologically driven, and I think there needs to be more of an emphasis and understanding on the social dimension. That, I believe, is what makes it really challenging. It's a complex system, so forecasting how technologies are taken up and how society forms around or with those new technologies is difficult to understand. So we need to explore those different ideas and the potential implications that has for the policies around achieving net zero. So those are the sorts of conversations, I think, that are going on. The technical we're better with at the moment. The social and the socio-technical are ones where we're sort of needing to do more.
And on that point, do we have, I suppose, a bit of a political issue here, whereby, in a democratic society, obviously you need to gain votes, and maybe there's a perception that that's a lot easier to do when you're announcing things that are seen as widely positive, increases in renewable energy, that kind of thing. Whereas telling people that they need to use less energy, or they need to, cut down on their meat consumption or whatever it may be, are a bit less sexy, shall we say? Are there certain things that we're going to need to broach, and are sort of us as citizens, but equally for politicians, are there certain situations and certain things that we need to consider that just are going to be necessary if we're going to reach some of these lofty targets that we're setting?
I mean, I think it's undoubtedly the case that governments, particularly in the UK, but I'm sure it's true elsewhere, see certain areas as off limits. The idea of a meat tax comes up frequently. I think it's been used as a stick to beat climate policy in the US. A tax on, the idea that Biden's Green New Deal would mean, no more burgers. So, certainly governments have shied away from those sorts of areas because they fear the political backlash. I think there's a few things going on. One is there's lots of different ways to get to net zero. We don't necessarily have to tackle diet, but if we do tackle diet, it will unlock lots of opportunities. It reduces emissions not only in the food sector, but allows us to use land in different ways, perhaps for afforestation and so on, to offset some of the residual emissions in other parts of the economy. I don't think this need always be seen as an impossibility for government to take that sort of area on. I mean, if you look at something like the sugar tax that's been introduced in this country, but also in other parts of the world, governments can eventually come around to the idea of making those sorts of interventions. And I think perhaps more interestingly, we've seen over the past recent years a very dramatic shift in the availability of meat alternatives, plant-based foods, and not only the availability of those products, but also public attitudes towards them. Even companies like Burger King and Greggs offering vegan sausage rolls and burgers. So I think that there is potential for some of those societal changes to happen even without push from government.
And I suppose looking at this, as you said, there are several different ways to get to net zero. One of the things that will come up often is these kind of negative emissions technology. So things like biofuels with carbon capture and storage, things like that. Are these things that are going to have to be ramped up and that have to kind of come into operational existence in a big manner if we're going to get to net zero? Or are these things that are, kind of magical thinking, as some people put it?
I think it follows on with the idea of there's different ways to get to where you want to be. Carbon capture and storage as a concept has been around for quite a while and researched. It's sort of beginning to be implemented in certain locations. It's really yet to be seen, I think, how much traction it takes and how popular it proves to be. I think there is a bit of a sort of conflict, if you like, in the idea of adding carbon capture and storage to existing fossil fuel sources in terms of power generation adds expense. And when we're trying to shift away more generally from the use of those sources, then there's an economic case as well to say, well, is this actually worth pursuing? If we can pursue alternatives, let's go down those alternatives.
And is there a risk that these kind of technologies that aren't yet available at scale might distract from developments elsewhere?
We pretty much need to tackle everything. That is, so it's the hard to abate sectors, it's the negative technologies, it's the societal changes. COVID showed us how things can change very quickly from one moment to the next. I'm not sure if it's a good or a bad thing, but climate change itself can drive the change. It is happening. We are not tackling it. Action falls very, very short from where we need to go. It's getting worse by the year. And once this really starts to touch most of us, this tolerance to change will increase for sure. That is my opinion.
Ross, you asked about the idea of negative emissions distracting us from the task at hand. I mean, this is something that's really concerned, a lot of people, activists, scientists, researchers. And they talk about the idea of mitigation deterrence, which is effectively, getting to net zero means you're balancing continued emissions on the upside and negative emissions on the bottom side. And you can have really big continued emissions and really big negative emissions and you still have zero, or you can have very close to zero emissions with a much smaller role for negative emissions. And those things aren't equivalent. And moreover, because we don't know if negative emissions will in fact be possible, the idea that the assumption that those will become available is effectively a risk. So if we fail to cut emissions in the next decade because we hope and expect that negative emissions will come to the rescue in the future, that's effectively betting on their availability. And if, on the other hand, negative emissions fail to turn up, then we will have blown our carbon budgets and we won't be able to stay below our chosen temperature targets. So one argument, I've recently been reviewing a research paper on this very question, and their conclusion effectively was that if we account for the risk that negative emissions may not be deployable at the scale required, then that implies we need to cut emissions in the near term much more quickly, effectively just ensuring against that risk that they don't turn up.
And Marcia, you mentioned there that as we start to feel the impact of climate change, that we're going to do more about it. I suppose that does raise the question that a lot of the impacts of climate change, the immediate impacts or the near-term impacts of climate change, are going to be felt initially in poorer countries, whereas arguably the places where mitigation is most effective, or certainly where emissions are highest, is in rich countries. And I suppose this brings up questions of kind of justice and questions of fairness in terms of where these cuts are made and the kinds of commitments that different countries are making. What do you feel are the sort of important considerations around fairness when it comes to net zero targets and around emissions reductions more generally?
First, I'm not sure that the impacts will only concentrate on the developing country, on let's say around the tropics. They are more intense, but over perhaps longer term, it's really that the losses and damages from those impacts and the possibility to adapt is much lower in those countries. But what we've seen the past year of wildfires in Australia or in California, it's really everywhere. It does raise a lot of questions around justice, and I think just the net zero issue is already it already embeds questions around justice, because is it net zero by mid-century for everyone? If it is for everyone, are the countries to pay for it themselves, or is it the richer countries that will need to pay for it in developing countries? Can the developing world come to net zero earlier so that emerging economies and other developing countries can come to net zero at a later point? Because we are always talking about budgets. So there are many questions around that. And one way that has been proposed is that for at least countries to, whenever putting forward their target, that net zero target, first, being clear about it. Am I going to achieve those emissions reductions at home? Am I going to purchase those emissions reductions elsewhere? Am I going to finance emissions reductions and not account for them in my own inventories, for example, because that is part of also taking the lead. And already if a country can express and explain how they see their target as fair, this brings transparency to the discussion, I would say.
To me, there's also a question here of whether it's appropriate to look at emissions by country, because politically those borders make sense, but in terms of trade, use of resources, and therefore the drivers for these emissions, it perhaps doesn't make sense. And I'm not sure that that's being tackled properly when it comes to understanding emissions and issues of fairness and equity associated with those emissions.
There's two things that I think are really interesting about where we are now with climate policy discussions. One is that net zero has really changed the conversation, I think. It's no longer possible for sectors or countries to kind of hide behind the idea that we don't have to get to zero. It used to be the case that aviation, for example, could say, well, it's really hard to cut emissions from aviation, but it's okay because we're only cutting emissions by 80% by 2050. So we can be part of that 20% that doesn't get tackled. Similarly for countries, when it used to be a case of developing countries had developed countries had targets, developing countries didn't, and the targets all varied. That there was lots of space for some countries to go fast, other countries to go slow. With net zero, and the idea of carbon budgets, we don't solve the problem until on a global level we get to net zero. And then the question becomes, does some countries go faster? Do some countries go slower? Who pays for the reductions? Do some countries end up having to go towards negative emissions? Would the EU, for example, end up by 2050 or beyond 2050 going into negative emissions to offset continued emissions in somewhere like India, where they have a rapidly expanding population that currently doesn't have access to modern energy services in many cases? So I think that raises some really interesting questions. I think the other thing that's really changed is about this idea that, you know, meeting climate targets is a sacrifice and somehow a cost that has to be paid. And, you know, I think that the conversation has really moved on, and obviously there are very substantial investments and challenges in terms of transitioning to a zero carbon economy, which will have to be paid for. But nevertheless, overall, reaching net zero and becoming a net zero society on a global level may in fact be a net benefit economically. And so the question is not so much who's going to make the sacrifice, but how do we enable that transition?
In that regard, let me just finish by asking you how confident, I suppose, you feel about the road to net zero, where we are on it, and what you think the future holds, if you like. Big question.
I'm not sure for the right reasons, but I am optimistic and I am confident that we can get there. The fact that the target's a little bit of a, let's say, a jungle at the moment, that we've seen with the NDCs, and it's exactly the same discussion then with the net zero. What is the scope, coverage, by when, how, year target, period target? So all those issues that affect really. I don't think it's an easy task at all. I do think there's momentum. Again, I'll bring that point again. I think climate change itself will drive that change, will help drive that change, along with the opportunities that transition creates. So yeah, overall, I am confident. I think there is momentum for change, the need and energy for that. And
Simon, how about you? What do you think?
So I think, you know, there's two ways of looking at this. I think if we look back to you know, the build up to the Paris Agreement being signed at COP21, you know, the focus up till that point had very much been on 2 degrees. The idea of there being a, you know, an inclusive global agreement where all countries made commitments to cut, you know, to tackle their emissions, that all seemed very distant, you know, and the idea that global agreement would not only target well below 2 degrees, but actually aim for 1.5 degrees, you know, that I think very few people would have anticipated. And we're now in a place where, you know, 3/4 of global emissions are covered by some sort of net zero target. Now, there are, you know, still, despite all of that progress, there's massive gaps. So between the collective ambition of countries' targets, there's a huge gap from there to a 1.5 pathway. And then from the collective ambition of countries' targets, there's also a huge gap in terms of implementation, in terms of actually making those targets happen on the ground. So, you know, the task is huge, but the conversation has changed in a big way.
Thanks, Simon. And Stefan, how about from your perspective?
You know, since the Paris Agreement, we've seen a big shift in the amount of talk politically about climate change and a need to address it, and meeting some targets in relation to greenhouse gas emissions and reductions, which I think is really great. You know, and you know, it's getting more and more momentum. It's becoming more mainstream in conversations, sort of publicly as well, and rather than talks between, you know, skeptics or deniers and those sorts of challenges, we're actually now talking more about the technical and social challenges that we face. But I think that's the really difficult conversation and the really difficult thing to understand, how we address both those technical and social challenges that we're being faced with. And I don't think politically we have a handle on that. And I don't think from a knowledge and technical perspective we have a full understanding of that yet. There's potential. There's, you know, you can see some light on the horizon, but we really need to see the momentum ramping up much more if we're going to get to where we need to be.
I just had one kind of final thought, if I can. You know, I think part of the way the narrative has changed, you know, we've seen this dramatic shift away from the idea that tackling climate change is purely a burden and a sacrifice that we have to make because, you know, otherwise we're going to face dangerous warming. And now, you know, there is much greater recognition of the enormous harms which come along with our use of fossil fuels, be it the deaths caused by air pollution, or from coal-fired power stations, or combustion engine cars, and much more recognition of the opportunities for effectively a cleaner, better future as we transition towards net zero. And I think that shift in narrative is very powerful, and it is very profound. And I think that if there's any reason to have hope that we may make progress towards net zero, and ultimately limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, it's that change in conversation.
Well, that sounds like a very good point to stop on, so thank you very much, guys. So yeah, it does just remain for me to thank all of my guests, MARCIA ROCHA from the OECD, Simon Evans from Carbon Brief, and STEFÁN Smith from the University of Reading. So thank you very much, guys, and thank you to you for watching this video. I'll see you next time.